Whether a simple piece of cardboard or a hand-carved mahogany box with designs intricately inlaid, the GM screen is something that many GMs have come to rely on. They're usually used to obscure campaign information, die rolls, and hit points so as to create a sense of mysterious atmosphere for the players. With the screen in place, the players won't be able to anticipate what the GM has planned for them, making the whole session feel a lot more spontaneous and exciting. And during combat, the GM hides the hit points of each monster behind this impenetrable wall. However, there is an ongoing debate about whether or not GMs tend to abuse the value of the GM screen to fudge hit points. We have talked about this in the past. Generally speaking, we here at Incendium RPGs recommend that DMs avoid fudging die rolls and hit points so as to preserve the integrity of the game. Why rely on randomness at all if you're just going to overrule it when you don't like the outcome? But this does bring up another interesting question. In the game of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, the stat blocks present the hit points of each monster at the top as an average calculated based on the hit dice of the monster. Usually it says something like, quote, HP 20, open parentheses, 2d10 plus 10, close parentheses, end quote. 20 in this case being the average of those dice, and the parentheses showing where the calculation came from. With this, we can also calculate a minimum and maximum value of 12 and 30, respectively. This actually leaves room for individual monsters to have different amounts of hit points. Hello everyone, my name is Ian from Incendium RPGs, and today we're going to be talking about the different strategies and methods you can use when calculating hit points for a monster, and what the pros and cons are of each method. But before we begin, it's time for a subscriber roll-off. I'm going to be rolling this d20 as a persuasion check, and you have to roll a d20 for insight against it. If my number beats yours, then you have to subscribe to the channel, and if it doesn't, well, we'll give it another shot next time. For this roll-off, I'm going to be using my gray dice with gold numbers. This is the die that I use for characters that have relatively gray morals, or even some potential for emotional development throughout the course of the campaign. In fact, I might even switch out the dice as the campaign goes on. So let's see what we get. A 5. Well, I don't know, maybe you guys will have even worse luck than I do. If you got below a 5, then welcome to the channel. I'm going to be presenting 3 different methods that you could use to calculate hit points for your encounters. The examples that I'm going to be using are specific to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but if you're playing in a similar system, it should work there as well. The reason we're analyzing the pros and cons of each method is to help you decide what works best for you and your players at your table. And despite the mystery created by the GM screen, we think it's actually really best if you're transparent with your players about what method you're using, so as to preserve the integrity of the game and help your players to trust you more. With all that said, let's get into it. Probably the most common way to calculate hit points is to use the hit point average, which is often found at the top of the stat block. I've used this for most of my GMing career, and I find it works pretty well. With a consistent level of hit points, the challenge of an encounter becomes a lot more predictable and easily balanced. There are fewer variables to worry about while the players are just trying to whittle down a static number. For the GM, it becomes a lot easier to track multiple individual monsters, and for the players, it becomes a lot easier to gauge the survivability of monsters and the encounter as a whole. If it's clear by the end of round 3 that the monster just isn't going down, that might be an indicator that the players should retreat for now. And if the players are encountering the same kind of creature multiple times, then they are more likely to come up with a dominant strategy that is reliable in defeating this creature over and over. That way, the combat feels a lot more like a puzzle and less like a slog. If the rules are consistent, the combat can feel a lot more like a puzzle. Check out our puzzles video. A lot of players prefer this method because of it. They can trust that the DM is abiding by a consistent set of rules instead of making arbitrary changes in the middle of the combat. One downside that we've encountered when using this method is the effect that it has on dramatic impact. Using this method, sometimes monsters will be left with just 1 HP, even if a player has just used a particularly dramatic and exciting move to try and end the fight. And unfortunately, that just can leave players feeling unsatisfied. Interestingly enough, the GM over on Advantage has this sell it to me mechanic that they use to solve this problem. Whenever a player just barely misses the mark on an AC or leaves a monster standing with 1 HP, the GM will ask them to sell it to them. And this way the player gets to describe in dramatic detail, however much they choose, how they are able to overcome this difference in the numbers. I always thought this was a pretty neat solution. If you're interested in checking out more of the adventures of those playing on the Live Play podcast Advantage, you can go over to the Darkmoor Podcast Network for more. Links in the description below. And of course, the predictability of averages can also be a negative, as it can become stale over time. Let's say the party is fighting 8 ghouls. Once they take out 4 of those ghouls, then the combat can feel like it's starting to lose its sense of excitement. They've already discovered their reliable strategy to help them win. They've done this song and dance before. Why let 22 more hit points stand in the way of a good narrative? So what do the other methods have to offer then? Another method is to roll for the hit points of each monster using the hit dice in the parentheses next to the average. This method is usually done as part of your prep, and it gives you a wide variety of different HP levels for the individual monsters that you're employing. And because you're using the hit dice, of course you're going to roll somewhere around the average anyway. It's just that it's going to create a little bit more random generation. And because of this, it increases the unpredictability of an encounter. A monster might be stronger or weaker than it normally is. You could have a powerful kobold with 10 HP instead of 5, which is comparable to a level 1 player character. Or you might have a frail beholder with an HP of 95, nearly half of its official average. And for some players, this may reinforce their immersion in the game. No two monsters are the same. That, and for GMs like me, it's exciting to get to roll some dice as part of my prep work, which will help me inform my combat's design. A more subtle benefit is if your table is concerned about metagaming, such as if a player owns the monster manual, then rolling for hit points can help mitigate that potential threat to the gaming experience. This method prevents them from predicting too much about the fight. This is especially true if your player has had a lot of experience playing the game, or even some experience as a GM, and it can be hard to ignore the knowledge they've accrued over that time period. With a frail beholder, a player that metagames might think that they need to use more valuable resources than they actually do to take it out. And with a kobold that is 10 HP instead of 5, they might underestimate the durability of this monster and let it get the best of them. That being said, it's really important to clue in these things to your players. Maybe this kobold is super buff and has huge muscles compared to its counterparts, and maybe this beholder looks really sick and unwell. Unfortunately, one of the strengths of this method is also its weakness. Because of the unpredictability of the HP, the encounter might start to feel a little bit swingy. The side that's winning might change back and forth for a little bit, depending on who's being targeted and when. Many GMs know that even simple changes to a monster's durability can result in some dangerous scenarios, even a TPK if you're not careful. In addition, tracking multiple units with different HP values can be tough enough. Tracking 8 different kobolds with 8 different HP levels really can bog down gameplay sometimes. So if this method seems intriguing, just know that you're going to need some really strong organizational skills to keep everything flowing smoothly. All that being said, rolling for HP may start to inspire some peripheral design changes in your encounters. For example, if these kobolds know that they're especially weaker than their kin, using traps and cover to fight the players might be a particularly good tactic for them, because they know that they are weaker. One dastardly idea from WebDM was to let the kobolds throw jars of rock grubs at the players. Just make sure your players are okay with a slightly deadlier encounter than they might be used to. Which brings us to our last method. This last method is probably the most controversial that I'm going to present to you today. It involves the use of the minimum and maximum value calculated based on a monster's hit dice. For example, an adult red dragon has a hit dice value of 19d12 plus 133. Rolling all ones on the d12s would give you a minimum of 152 hit points, and rolling all 12s would give you a maximum of 361. Rather than having a static hit point total where it's randomly generated or the average, the GM instead keeps this floor and ceiling in mind. Once the players have dealt the minimum amount of damage in the range, the dragon can be reasonably killed anytime afterward at the GM's discretion. The GM might wait for a suitably dramatic moment for the fight to end, or use it as a signal for the dragon to retreat. Like with rolling hit points, this can make combat a little bit more unpredictable. Monsters might die at different thresholds depending on how the fight is going. The GM also has a tighter control over the pace of combat than she would when just using the averages, which can potentially lead to very satisfying dramatic moments. The encounter speed can be quickened or slowed depending on what the GM interprets as the energy level of their players, and in my experience, this is often best used when encountering a boss. Encountering powerful boss monsters is where storytelling matters most for the players, so using the hit point range might be a good idea. I myself tried to use this in encounter using golems. The players were encountering 7 or 8 crystal golems who I'd designed to be literal glass cannons. They fired these rays of light that dealt a whopping 68 to my level 5 player characters. To balance this, I gave them an AC of 10 and used hit point ranges. Whenever a player had dealt a significant amount of damage over the threshold, the minimum, HP value, that's when I allowed that monster to die. It should be noted that this was the only encounter of the session. In fact, it was the sole reason that we had convened to play that day. And I wanted to be a little bit more in control of how long that session went. I'm the kind of GM that likes a lot of social interaction and exploration in my games too, even though I definitely think combat is really important. Thus, I was eager to see my players succeed and learn more about the plot from the NPCs that were also nearby. If you saw my Spilling the Beans episode, this is the same encounter from that session. Overall, things seemed to go well. Nobody had a bad time, and there was only one player, John, who discovered exactly what I was doing with the hit point ranges. He actually thought I was randomly generating the HP at first. However, this does bring us back to our earlier problem. This method can feel like the GM is fudging hit points. Because monsters may go down at different times, using this method too often can lead to players distrusting their DM. Even skilled GMs might misread the energy levels of the players and cause combat to go on for too long or too short of a time. The biggest problem with this method is the secrecy that it relies on to execute correctly. If you are transparent with your players right off the bat and tell them that you're using this method, it may start to feel like their abilities and their attack rolls don't really matter in the course of the combat. After all, you as the GM are deciding when these monsters die or don't die. And if you don't tell them, but a player catches on, the whole combat design can feel disingenuous. That being said, this method can be used after the fact. For example, if you prepared a contingency form of the monster, a second form as you will, maybe even a final form.
Oh yeah, that's happening right now.
Then the players will have something that they can rely on to provide a good challenge if the first part of the combat is too easy. Likewise, you might even find that the first form is much more powerful than you predicted, and when the monster is defeated, you just quietly ignore the second form that you had waiting. However you choose to go about this, open and honest communication is key to providing a great experience for your players. As a matter of fact, when John asked me about the hit points of this encounter, it's what led to the conversation that sparked the idea for this video. And that's what this video is really about, trust. We've talked a little bit about trust in our REST video, respect, empathy, satisfaction, and trust, which you can check out in the links below. And this is definitely one of those times where it comes up. In order to have fun at the table, the players need to be able to trust that the GM has their best gaming experience in mind, whether that means standing as an impartial moderator of the rules or engineering heightened emotional moments for a great storytelling experience. In either case, when the GM starts to fudge hit points, die rolls, or anything else, not only does it detract from the integrity of the game, but it removes trust that the players have built up in the group. Even when the GM fudges in favor of the players, this can still make the players feel like their decisions don't really matter. Keeping a boss monster from dying or allowing a minion to perish earlier than the others is often the cause of this. Like we said, be transparent with your players about what method you're using in combat, including for hit points. This is especially true after the combat has already ended. In my experience, I'm very open with my players about whether or not a monster has a static hit point value or uses a range. This way they can give me their direct feedback, which allows me to act on it, facilitating the game that we all want to play. Building trust isn't about using one superior method or another. It's about making sure that your players have the most joy possible and know that you take their experience seriously. That's what leads to them having more faith in you. And that's the video. That's what we have to say right now on using hit points in your combat encounters. What method of hit points do you guys usually use? Will you consider using a different method after hearing about these other ones? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, let YouTube know by pressing that like button. Making those numbers go up really allows our videos and our content to get out to more people, and it makes what we're doing feel a lot more worthwhile. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will catch you guys next time. Fudge hit points. Dun dun dun.